I'd be so grateful if you could just take any rubbish with you and just pop them in the bins on your way out. That would be fabulous. Okay, so without further ado, I would love to welcome to the stage two wonderful authors and one wonderful explorer. It's presented by GAIL. This panel is called Mallory and the Conquest of Everest, excuse me. And we have Wade Davis in conversation with the wonderful Patrick French. Patrick French, please welcome them to the stage. Thank you so much.
Hello, it's great to be back on stage and to see some distinguished figures in the audience. I met Wade Davis, I think it must be what, Wade, about 10 years ago?
About 13, actually.
Oh.
I can measure that from the length of time it took me to write this damn book. That's when I first met you.
So time has flown, but we met in London, and I had previously written the biography of France's young husband, the explorer and mystic, which connected in various ways with Wade's truly phenomenal book, Into the Silence, which won the Samuel Johnson Prize for non-fiction last year. And although I was, in fact, one of the judges on that panel, be assured it was a unanimous choice of all five of us. And I remember at the time thinking that what he was attempting to do was a very ambitious project, the idea of linking the early expeditions up Everest to, if you like, the kind of wider history of the time, and in particular the First World War experiences of the people who were involved in it. And I remember not fully understanding how those links would work, but my God, once you've read this book, you then look at that whole period of history in a different way, and you realize that to see the Everest expeditions as being in some way detached from history was the mistake, and that in fact they are integral to those in many ways quite horrific first 2-3 decades of the 20th century. But Wade Davis has had a really remarkably varied career, traveling in Borneo, Nepal, Peru, Polynesia, Guinea, Australia, Mongolia, all sorts of places, living among 15 different indigenous groups in Latin America, making 6,000 botanical collections, writing books such as the very well-known The Serpent and the Rainbow, a beautiful book called The Clouded Leopard, which I love, and also One River, which is a phenomenal sort of prodigious feat of, again, going and looking at individuals in the way that they have an effect upon the history of our time or of earlier times. But there's one thing which, as far as I know, has no connection at all to Everest, which I'd just like to very quickly ask Wade about before I ask him to introduce the book, and that is his discovery about zombies. Now, to most of you, when you think of zombies, you think of a horror movie and a zombie kind of coming up out of the grave and marching among you. But in fact, it comes out of a genuine tradition of voodoo in Haiti, a country which in itself is one of the most interesting countries in the Caribbean, in part because of the 1801 revolution led by Toussaint Louverture, the only time when a slave rebellion turned into a sort of full-on nationalist movement and self-rule, expelling the colonial power about 150 years before anyone else. But that's a kind of diversion. But Wade, will you just tell us a little about how you make a zombie?
Zombies never die. I hadn't expected to speak about this, but I work as the explorer in residence of the National Geographic. I'm a social anthropologist, and my mission really is to celebrate the wonder of culture around the world. And the anthropological lens is most usefully honed when it points to a phenomenon of which people have little understanding, but about which they make harsh judgments. And were you to ask yourself to name the great religions of the world, what would you say? Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, whatever, there's always one continent left out, sub-Saharan Africa, and the tacit assumption being that people of equatorial West Africa had no religion. Well, of course, by ethnographic definition they did. And voodoo is not a black magic cult, as the Hollywood movies would imply. It's simply the distillation of very profound religious ideas that came over during the tragic diaspora of the slavery era and became sown in the fertile soil of the New World. In many ways, voodoo is a quintessentially democratic faith because the acolyte does not have to go through the intermediary role of a priest to achieve the divine. He or she enters the realm of the spirits, and that's why often Haitians or West Africans would say to me, you white people go to church and speak about God, we dance in the temple and become God. And as Patrick said, I've had an eclectic career. I live by the adage of Marshall McLuhan, if it works, it's obsolete. And I began as a social anthropologist, and I discovered the wonder of botany. And my mentor at Harvard University was a legendary plant explorer, Richard Evans Schultes, who sparked the psychedelic era with his discovery of the so-called magic mushrooms in Mexico in 1938. He later slipped away from the university to spend 12 uninterrupted years in the northwest Amazon, where he lived amongst unknown peoples, traveled unknown rivers, all the time enchanted by the wonder of the neotropical rainforest. And he was such a odd choice to become a 60s icon because his politics were wildly conservative. He didn't vote for the Republican Party. He professed not to believe in the American Revolution. He always voted for Her Majesty, Queen Elizabeth II. He was such an Anglophile that his colleagues said that the only way for Schultes to go native would be to go to London. And at the age of 18, I rapped on his door on his 4th floor eyrie at the Harvard Botanical Museum, and I got as far as saying, "Sir, I'm from British." Well, that adjective was all it took. I'm from British Columbia. I've saved up money in a logging camp. I want to go to the Amazon as you did and collect plants. Now this, you must understand, is a man for whom mountains and national parks have been named in South America. He is a legend on the level of Wallace Spruce, indeed Darwin. And rather than asking for my credentials, of which there were none, I had never taken a botany class in my life. I knew nothing of the Amazon. He simply peered across a mound of plant specimens through his antiquated bifocals and said very simply, "Well, son, when would you like to go?" And 2 weeks later, I was in the Amazon, where I stayed for a year and a half. And just an aside, to placate my very British little old mother in Victoria, British Columbia, I went back to his office just before I left to get some points from the great man that Prince Philip had called the father of the Amazon. And Professor Schultes had 3 critical recommendations. He said, don't bother with leather boots because all the snakes bite at the neck. And then he said, don't forget to wear a pith helmet because in 13 years he had never lost his bifocals. And third, he said, don't come back from the Amazon without trying ayahuasca, the most potent of the hallucinogenic preparations of the shaman's repertoire. And I did go off to South America. I lived in the forests of the Amazon and the Andes for 4 years, and I came back and I was studying botany for my dissertation at Harvard. When I kind of grew weary of collecting plants, it had begun to feel almost like collecting hay. Maybe because as an anthropologist, I didn't have such confidence in traditional in orthodox scientific taxonomies. I'd lived too long with the shaman, and I was always looking for something new, and that always awaited you in the 4th floor office of the great professor. And one miserable February day in 1982, he summoned me to his office, and he asked me very casually whether I'd be interested in taking a couple of weeks off, going to the Caribbean island nation of Haiti, infiltrating the secret societies, and securing the formula of a folk poison used to make zombies. Well, naturally, I said yes, having no idea that this casual assignment would in time consume 4 years of my life, because within 24 hours of arriving in Haiti, something was made available to me that had eluded me in 4 years in the Amazon, and that was truly a window wide open to the mystic. And I was not looking for a drug that can make zombies, because no drug can make a social phenomenon. We had a case that was medically verifiable of an individual who'd been misdiagnosed dead and turned up in the realm of the living, and there had to be a natural explanation, and that would lie in the realm of folk preparations. And there had been a rumor through all the literature, through all the accounts, it was even specifically mentioned in the Penal Code of Haiti, the existence of a folk poison that was said to bring on a state of death so profound that it could fool a physician. In fact, it was specifically outlawed in the penal code of the country. And so, as it turned out, there was a drug. It was derived from a series of species of marine fish. The drug was Tetrodotoxin. It's about 1,000 times stronger than potassium cyanide, 160,000 times stronger than cocaine hydrochloride as an anesthetic. A lethal dose would bounce on the head of a pin. And more importantly, it causes peripheral paralysis, dramatically low metabolic rates, and yet consciousness is retained until the moment of death. And so this took the whole idea of the zombie, the living dead, from the realm of the phantasmagoric into the realm of the plausible. Then you had to ask, why is this going on? As it turned out, the most powerful arbiter of social and political life in Haiti, as in Equatorial West Africa, with those profound African antecedents, are the secret societies. And the secret societies had never been documented by anthropology, and I became the first outsider ever to actually become initiated into the secret societies. And I was able to show that zombification, this phenomenon which had been used in an explicitly racist way to denigrate a people and their great religious ideas, had a foundation within the culture somewhat analogous to capital punishment. You would never measure the strength of American democracy based on the institution of capital punishment, but it does exist. And zombification was the ultimate social sanction because it implied two things: the physical loss of freedom, which evoked horrific memories of the era of slavery, but more important, a spiritual loss, because the sacred cycle of the divine is severed with the capturing of the soul that creates the personality of the individual, leaving the individual in a state of perpetual purgatory.
So Wade, I'm gonna cut across you now because I
you asked, man, you're gonna get it. But let's get to Everest.
I know we could actually spend 4 years on zombies quite happily.
But you know, it's actually, you know, the thing that's interesting is that it shows the eclectic. People have often said about this Everest book, oh, it's a great departure for you.
It's not.
It's not a departure at all.
True. So okay, so let's begin by, why don't you just explain, you know, how you came to write this book, right, and the process of research, which I have to say was extremely long and deep. It was not only about looking at, for example, the records of particular battalions on the Western Front. It was also looking about the individual biographies of the people who went up the mountain. But as well as that, you looked at Nepali and Tibetan culture, and the way in which these mountaineers who were trying to, quote, conquer the mountain behaved, and why they did it and how they were perceived. So just say a little about that.
Well, the birth of this book really began in a serendipitous way as I completed a 4,000-mile journey from Chengdu in western China through southeastern Tibet to Lhasa and on to Kathmandu in the fateful spring of 1996, when the debacle happened on Everest that Krakauer so powerfully chronicled in his book Into Thin Air. And Kathmandu was abuzz with the discussion as to whether or not the mountain had been commercialized to an extent that was no longer acceptable. But leading that expedition was a good friend of mine, Dan Taylor, who was a real son of the Himalaya, son and grandson of medical missionaries, spoke fluent Hindi and Urdu, and his father had been a very close friend of Howard Somerville, who was Mallory's closest friend on the mountain. The very next fall, Daniel and I were back on the east face of Everest, the legendary Gama Valley, the Kanchung face, where you stand at Petanringbo on ground higher than anything in North America, even as you look up at 2 vertical miles of ice that rises to the South Pole. And we got caught as we were trying for the National Geographic to photograph snow leopards. We got caught in unusual snow conditions, and we thought we might have to winter in the Gama Valley, which was not the worst fate. And Daniel began in his inimitable way to speak of these Englishmen in tweeds who read Shakespeare to each other in the snow at 23,000 feet as they assaulted Everest. And as a great Anglophile, as a Canadian, I became enchanted. Now, the basic story is known to many of you. The English, having lost the race to the North and South Poles, an empire of explorers humiliated by that failure, turned to the Raj and turned to Everest, which shone like a diamond over Darjeeling, and Everest became the 3rd pole. And so before the war, the effort and the thought of climbing Everest was kind of a gesture of redemption for an empire of explorers who had lost the race to the poles. But as I argue in the book, in the wake of the cataclysm of the Great War, it became a mission of regeneration for a nation bled white by war. Famously, the British had to, in 1921, walk 400 miles off the map simply to come to close quarters with a mountain that no European had approached. In 1922 and 24, they went back, having solved the key to the North Pole, attempting to climb the mountain. And famously on June 8th, 1924, George Mallory, age 37, finest climber of the empire, and his young protege, Sandy Irvin, a boy just 22, were seen by Noel cresting the northeast ridge, going strong for the summit when the mist rolled in and enveloped their memory in myth. And the question that always haunted mountaineers, did they get to the top before they succumbed? I was never from the start interested in that question. I wanted to know who these men were who went aloft. Just from their age and their class, I knew they had gone through the agony of the Great War. And my sense was not that they were cavalier about death, but they would have seen so much of death that it had no hold on them, nothing more to teach them save that of their own. For that entire generation, life mattered less than the moments of being alive, and they were prepared to accept a level of risk that would have been unimaginable before the war. So I set out to find out where each of the 26 men who went to Everest on those expeditions had been every single day of the Great War. Now that may seem to be an impossible task, and it was famously said of both the Battle of Passchendaele and the Somme that the British Army lacked the clerk power to tabulate the dead. But if that was true, they took records of just about everything else. That war was so thoroughly chronicled that it's a wonder men found time to fight. And because the other thing you forget about that war was how small the British zone of operations was, never larger than the county of Lincolnshire. The British frontage was often as short as 85 miles, never longer than 125 miles. Now behind that frontage, the British built 6,000 miles of railroad, 6,000 miles of trenches. The salient around the old medieval cloth town of Ypres in Belgium, an area a man could walk around in a long day or two, 4 miles by 12 miles, would see the death of 1.7 million boys of both sides over the 4 years and 4 months of the war. And not only was the zone of operations small, because so many millions flowed through it, and because in the wake of the war there was a tsunami of literature, poetry and prose, journals, letters, there was no point on that battlefield that hadn't been chronicled in multiple voices every single day of the conflict. So you could find out not only where the men had been, but also to ascertain with a specificity that I would have thought unimaginable before the onset of the research what they had been exposed to. And that journey that took me to over 80 archives and regimental archives throughout Britain and Europe and libraries and institutions in the United States was itself, in a way, a journey through the twilight memory of hell. Now just step back for a second, think about this war. At the outbreak of hostilities, you had to be 5'8" to enter the British Army. Within 2 months, men 5'3" were eagerly accepted. Cremation was born of that war. It didn't exist as an institution in Britain until that conflict, but in the wake of the war, it became the preferred form of dealing with the dead for countless tens of thousands who had lived 4 years and 4 months with the stench of rotten cadavers. Plastic surgery was born of the war and the need to repair the shell-scarred faces of young boys who for the rest of their lives would live behind masks and attend special weekend holiday camps where they could remove these masks and feel the wind on their gargoyle features without fear of humiliation and shame. The regular British Army and Empire needed 2,500 shovels every year. In the mud of Flanders, 10 million would be required. 25,000 Welsh coal miners spent the entire war underground, ferreting beneath the enemy lines to detonate charges of DDT that reverberated and were heard at Hampstead Heath in London. Every month, the British Army required 1,000 subalterns. 10,000 subalterns, to replace a litany of dead. Now think about it, the entire Iraq-Afghani fiascos of the Americans has not led to the death of 10,000 boys and girls of the United States. Every month they needed 10,000, so entire schools, Charterhouse where Mallory taught, Winchester where he attended, graduated their entire classes to the Great War. The sound of the war. At Waterloo, Napoleon and Wellington discharged 20,000 cannon shot in 3 days. In a single days on the Western Front, each side would exchange 1 million shells. The scent of the battle. You tend to think of the battles as, these bayonet charges. Bayonets accounted for 1/3 of 1% of morbidity. 35% of the men were killed by machine gun fire and rifle, but 65% simply clung in terror to the edges of a mud walls. A rain of steel and fire fell from the sky. Women spoke about the war in the metaphor of dance. Diana Cooper said that after the war, every boy I'd ever danced with was simply dead. Vera Brittain, who lost her brother, her fiancé, and her two best male friends, simply said there was no one left to dance with. Stephen Spender said that in the wake of the war, the British middle class continued to dance, unaware that the dance floor had fallen out from beneath them. And so this was a backdrop to these stories of Everest. And as it turned out, of the 26 men who went to Everest, 6 escaped the conflict. Two old, one a schoolmaster, one a diplomat, Sandy too young, but 20 saw the worst of the fighting. 4 as surgeons dealt every day with the litany of the dead. 2 lost brothers. John Noel, who went to his death, the famous photographer, telling anyone who would listen about his experience on the front. I was able to find out, unknown to even his own family, he spent the entire war in an asylum, shattered with shell shock. All of them had seen the agonies of the dying, the white faces of the dead. And this then became the backdrop of that time. As Tom Longstaff laconically wrote to Arthur Hinks when they finally began to put together a team of climbers in 1921, the supply of young climbers, he wrote, is not quite what it was before the war. Every year before the war, in this kind of fluorescence of idealism that marked that whole Bloomsbury pre-war English society of Oxbridge, where men could speak of love between men without shame, climbing was part of politics, it was part of poetry, and they would all gather at Pennypass in Wales and by day climb and by night recite poetry and dream new dreams of a new century. Of the men who were photographed by Geoffrey Winthrop Young in the Pennypass photo diary, fully 26 would die at the front and 17 be left, like Geoffrey Winthrop Young, maimed for life. He would lose his leg to an Austrian shell on the Italian front. So that's really the backdrop by which these men went to war. And I'll just read you Geoffrey Winthrop Young. You know, this is what he wrote. He was at Ypres on April 22nd when the Germans attacked with poison gas for the first time. And it was only the suicidal defense of the Canadian Army that saved the British sector of the front. He said, "This horror was too monstrous to believe at first, but when it came, far as we had traveled from our civilized world of a few months back, the savagery of it, of the sight of men choking to death with yellow froth lying on the floor and out in the fields, made me rage with an anger that no later cruelty of man, not even the degradation of our kind by the hideous concentration camps in later Germany, ever quite rekindled. For then we still thought all men were human."
Wade, thank you for that very moving account. It's something that has an extraordinary resonance, I think, for many of us. I mean, my grandfather lost 4 brothers in that war, and on my mother's side of the family, there was another great uncle who was the first recipient of the Victoria Cross of the First World War and was then sort of turned into a figure of propaganda. The idea that he was a special kind of hero because he had died before they even knew what the war was going to be. He died at the Battle of Mons in the first military encounter. And of course, even for this audience, it has a resonance. I think that almost 1 million Indian citizens fought in the First World War.
Oh, absolutely.
On all sorts of different fronts. And I think I'm right in saying that about 60,000 Indians died. I mean, it was truly...
By November of 1914, 9,790 Indian troops had died at a time on the Western Front when they did not have winter uniforms and they were not allowed to be treated by a white nurse in a casualty clearing station. Now, to give you a sense of how the war played out in these lives, you know, when I first had this idea, there was a well-known biographer of Mallory who came up to me and said, you know, I hear you're looking into this war angle. I tell you, I've looked for it, it's not there. And of course, his supposition was I was suggesting that they were somehow discussing the Somme as they walked across Tibet. They never spoke about the war. Robert Graves and T.E. Lawrence famously made a pact never to speak about it. But how could it be ignored? And a perfect example of this, and it's kind of a wonderful, you know, when I should mention, as Patrick knows, because I met him in the throes of my agony in London, because when I wrote this I sent a letter to my agent that was taken to the market unbeknownst to me, and it resulted in the biggest book advance in the history of mountaineering. And then 3 months later, Conrad Anker found Mallory's body on Everest, and all hell broke loose, and there were going to be 10 books by fall. I offered to give all the money back, and Knopf said, we didn't give you all that money for a book on Mallory. We want a book by you on Mallory, so get on with it. And I flippantly said, it's going to take a decade. And it took 12 years, because it forced me to take the story to a level of breadth and depth that would have been unimaginable. And it was a gift. But it was frightening. When I remember when I first met you in London, you were very reassuring and very kind. But to give you an idea of, I always say that, Truman Capote said of Jack Kerouac, there's writing and there's typing. I say that there's research and there's Xeroxing. And as it turned out, without being disparaging in any way, many of these other books had just Xeroxed earlier works on Mallory. And all of these books had two fundamental flaws. They treated Mallory as a stick figure, as if he was alone on Everest. I mean, he was supported by a cast of 25 other men, each of whom was arguably more interesting than Mallory, plus an incredible assembly of figures from the Raj, the Great Game, people back in London, in Darjeeling, etc. And also they present these expeditions as if they existed outside of time. Nothing could be further from the truth. They were, they followed the route of Younghusband's invasion of 1904. Permission with the 13th Dalai Lama to enter Tibet in 1921 was a consequence of a sophisticated diplomatic initiative, an arms deal between Charles Bell and the 13th Dalai Lama, upon which the future of a free and independent and strong Tibet was to be based. And so when I still didn't know if I'd find anything new in the literature or whatever. And a first breakthrough that was so important to me was I was in the White Museum in Banff, Canada. And there's an unsung Canadian hero in the Everest saga in 1921. Now, Mallory hated Canadians. I'm a Canadian. I don't know how you hate a Canadian, but he famously hated Canadians. I didn't hold that against him much. But the real hero of Everest in 21 is not George Mallory. It was Oliver Wheeler, seconded to the expedition from the Survey of India, later Survey General of India, knighted during World War II. But Wheeler was the one who found the route to the North Pole, up the East Rongbuk Glacier. It was not George Mallory. In fact, George Mallory, not once but twice in a letter to his beloved wife Ruth, lied about what Wheeler had achieved and denied him that incredible achievement. It was Wheeler who spent more time higher on the mountain, exposed to the wrath of the mountain in 1921, than all the British put together. Forgotten figure in history, the first Canadian on Everest. This archivist said, Oliver's son's alive in Vancouver. I made a beeline to Vancouver and found this gentleman, 76 years old, living 4 doors from the house I was born in. I went to see him, and at the end of a long afternoon, all British historians had said there was only one diary journal kept in 21, a curt thing by Guy Bullock, Mallory's climbing friend, which was published by the Alpine Club in 1962. In the middle of this conversation, John Wheeler pulls from his shelf 2 fat journals written by his father as he marched across Everest in 1921. This was incredibly exciting to me for 2 reasons. First, it told me, if the Brits haven't found this, what else haven't they found? And in the end, they hadn't found really anything of this story. And I don't mean to be arrogant at all. It's just simply the surface of the story had scarcely been skated. But more importantly, in those journals, I knew I would find something special, and indeed I did. Now, in 1921, on that approach march, Arthur Kellis, high-altitude physiologist, 56 years old, too old for Everest, literally dies of exhaustion and is buried in the shadow of Kampazong, the fortress on the Tibetan plateau, where Younghusband in 1903 sat out those many months. On the day of his burial, Wheeler's journal entry reads simply, "Well, they buried the old boy in the morning. Thought it was going to be the afternoon. Terribly sorry to have missed it, but I do hate funerals." Well, how do you miss the burial of one of the 5 men you're walking across Tibet with? I knew the answer would be found on the Western Front. Wheeler was a soldier's soldier. He graduated from the Royal Military College in Kingston, our equivalent of Sandhurst, top of his class. He was with the 7th Merit Division in the Indian Army, a Royal Engineer, and at the outbreak of hostility, the entire Indian Army moved to France. They arrived in November. By that point in time, the Indians had already suffered over 8,000 dead. By that point in time, the topography of Armageddon had come into place. The trenches reached the British Channel, and both sides had begun to sap each other. It came to the attention of his command, and don't forget, by this point in time, the British Expeditionary Force is annihilated. The entire Allied British sector of the front is held by the Canadians in the north and the Indians in the south. And the Germans have sat within 30 feet of his front lines. He goes over the top with 125 Indian sepoy troops under his command, and to their horror, they find the saps full of Germans about to attack them. The result is a horrible melee of hand-to-hand combat. Eventually, the Indians push the Germans back, but not before the trench is filled, 3 bodies deep, with young boys of both sides, chest to chest, in their death throes, flailing about, as Wheeler would write in his journal, like trout in my crail. He does everything he can to get his men out, but in the chaos of battle, in the darkness of night, with artillery blasting on all sides, he never knows how many he had to bury alive. So when he says on Tibet, I do hate funerals, that shows you how the war was constantly. Jack Hazard climbed to the top of the North Col in 1924 with open bleeding wounds from the Somme saturating his climbing tunic.
Right across the world. It has an absolute resonance in India. And in fact, it's a subject that I always wonder why, probably as a product of, if you like, post-independence nationalist feeling, it is almost forgotten by Indian non-fiction writers today, and indeed by Indian fiction writers today. I think it's a very rich area about which a great deal more could be written. The role of Indian soldiers in that war, why people went into that war, how they perceived the two sides that were fighting as against India itself. Can I just divert you on something completely different? One of the very strange things which will be familiar to anybody who's read late 19th century British social history is that many of these people, and particularly Mallory and his kind of Bloomsbury environment, they lived in this strange kind of sort of academic stroke school stroke monkish world where they were having sex with each other, and yet it's not entirely clear if they're straight or gay, but it's a particular environment of the period.
I mean, one funny story, when this big book advance was announced in London, the British tabloids tripled its size, and the question was, how did this Canadian botanist get all this money for a book on British mountaineering? And the rumor was that I had proven that Mallory in 1923 in a speaking tour in Toronto had a homosexual affair. This was my big coup. Well, all you had to do is go to the British Library, and the only question was who in Britain had not tried to bed George Mallory. I think words like gay, straight, homosexual really have no meaning. I think that, as you said, the old saying about the British is they kept their dogs at home and sent their sons to kennels. And they lived a truly monastic world.
I'd never heard that one before, but I'll remember.
And they lived a truly monastic world. I mean, they had almost no encounter with the female. And although I had a long talk with a wonderful fellow here who presented the history of sex, sodomy was criminally sanctioned, but what happened on privately? I mean, George Mallory had a breathless love affair with James Strachey. Lytton Strachey was in love with Mallory. Duncan Grant was certainly in love with Mallory. And what's so fascinating is that all these men have these little dalliances that are very innocent in a way, and then they all go off and get married, and it's all sort of forgotten. I mean. And I think that's one of the reasons that it was harder for me to understand the world of Edwardian England than the world of 1910 Tibet. And I should say one thing I tried very hard, as Patrick knows, is to tell the story from the Tibetan side. So, for example, the legendary Rongbuk Monastery on the Rongbuk Glacier of the north face of Everest, mountaineers describe this in the vernacular of hippie ethnography. The monastery that's been there forever, and Shomalungma, ancient goddess mother of the world. I don't know what crackerjack box they get this information from. Everest was never a sacred mountain. The environs were, because they were sacred lands, bayous, where Guru Rinpoche, when he transmitted the Dharma at the behest of the Buddha, sowed the treasures. So the entire time the British were around Everest, they were walking in mystic space. And the Rongbuk Monastery doesn't go back forever. It was built by a charismatic Lama, Zatra Rinpoche, who was able to cadge funds for the newly wealthy Nepalese in the Solukhumbu Valley, who were newly wealthy because the British introduced the potato in 1870, and that led to the whole Sherpa movement toward Darjeeling. So to know what it was like in Rongbuk in 21, all I had to do is go and live as I did in Thupten Choling Monastery under the guidance of Trusik Rinpoche, who is a spiritual heir of Zatra Rinpoche, and to be in Thupten Choling in 2000 was to be in Rongbuk in 1921, because the liturgical cycle hadn't changed. I also got hold of the spiritual autobiography of Zatra Rinpoche, the Namtar, and had it translated for the first time. Now, this idea of, but Edwardian England was in a way a greater mystery to me, but let me just close with this wonderful thought. Why do I love these men? I love them because they remind me of my grandfather. You know, these who I never met, and he was a surgeon at the front. And, you know, what is about these men? They're men of discretion and decorum, so confident in their masculinity that they can speak of love between men without shame, and yet unprepared to litter the world with themselves, unprepared to yield their feelings to analysis, and yet quite capable of collecting a butterfly at dawn or a plant specimen before tea, paint a watercolor at noon, discuss Keats and Shelley and Shakespeare in the early afternoon, and still be prepared to assault the flanks of Everest or indeed the German lines by dusk. These were men of a certain caliber that I think for all the complex history of the Raj, we have to remember that this small island nation that in a sense never set out to rule the world and yet did so with such flair, produced these characters that had a kind of character that is beyond. One thing I love to do in slideshows is to show an actual photograph of the men in 21, all in their tweeds and their little Hamburg hats. They look about as mousy as a man can be. And yet one of them on the left is Williston the naturalist. And I mean, just Williston is one character. You know, he replies to an advertisement in the Times for an expedition to the Ruwenzori Mountains in Uganda. On 24-hour notice, he leaves London, travels 3 months to get to the jungle, spends 9 months in the jungle, and when the expedition is over, he says, why should I go back the same way? So he walks from the source of the Congo to the mouth, becoming the first man since Stanley to do it. A couple of years later, he decides he's going to climb the highest mountain in New Guinea. So first, what does an Englishman do? You go by Java, you buy 50 prisoners, you stop in at Borneo, you purchase 125 Dayaks, and with your white cadre, you march into the jungles to allow everybody to die. And indeed, that's precisely what happened. In the final scene, there's only one Englishman still fit who's having dinner service with Williston. The other Englishman's dying of malaria. And as they're having their perfect English dinner, the river is rising at their ankles toward their knees. And Williston in his journalism says, well, there was one bright spot. It wasn't too difficult to wash our dishes that night. You know, and I mean, for all the abuse of India and all the insanity, you've kind of got to love these guys, you know.
Okay, so let's now open this up to discussion or questions from the audience. And no, just one very brief point. The scandal of George Finch. Can you just very briefly refer to that before?
Well, this is worth telling. I mean, one of the big scandals in 21, there were only two men destined for the mountain. Mallory, a master of rock, George Finch, an Australian, a master of ice and snow. 2 weeks before they are scheduled to travel to Mumbai, they have to go through a medical exam on Harley Street. Mallory passes in flying colors, Finch fails. It becomes a huge scandal because a week later he goes up to Cambridge and in the oxygen deprivation tanks sets records for physical fitness. That summer in the Alps he set records for new summits. So the question was, did he get kicked off because he wasn't British? But that would involve the duplicity of Williston, a man incapable of deceit. And this has haunted mountaineering history because in 1922, when he was on the expedition, George Finch came damn close to summiting the mountain. He was probably the best climber in the world. Well, when I looked at the medical records, all the doctors were saying that his complexion was sallow, he hadn't been eating, he basically looked like shit. And so sometimes the best stuff can be found in the archives, but the really juicy material is found in the divorce court records on High Holborn Street. And the story began at an officer's dance in 1915 where he met and fell in love with a coquettish actress, 22. They had nothing in common but the moment. That was enough. They married, leaving their return address as no man's land. She stayed behind in England. He went off to the Salonika front to fight. In January of 1917, he hears that she's dying in London. He goes back on compassionate leave. finds her not only not dying, but very healthy, and the mother of a little baby boy that clearly is not his. So he goes off to France, thrashes to the point of death. The cuckold comes back. Betty swears her infinite fidelity. He goes back to the battle. That fidelity lasts about 6 weeks, but at this point it doesn't matter because he's fallen in love with another woman, Gladys May, a nurse on the Salonika front. He then comes back after the war, does everything he can to get rid of Betty, the first wife, who meanwhile has given him a baby boy that bears his name, who goes on to be the famous actor Peter Finch, incidentally, but is not of his blood. But by this point, his problem is he doesn't love Gladys May either anymore, but he has to marry her because she's now pregnant with a baby that is indeed his boy. And he's meanwhile fallen in love with a third woman, Agnes Bubbles Johnson. And so the problem is Gladys won't let him free, and it goes to court. And so he now is ordered back to court to do his proper duties to his second wife, who's about to, in fact, give birth to a baby boy. So he sets out to do what gentlemen did in that era, to free himself of this encumbrance. He sets out to do very public adultery in, as I discovered, room 477 on the Strand Hotel with 3 women, leaving his wife with a choice of public humiliation or granting him his freedom. So it turns out on the very day of the medical exam, George Finch had a couple things on his mind. First of all, out of one disastrous relationship, he inherited responsibility for a 4-year-old boy that bore his name but was not of his blood. Out of that same second relationship had come a boy that was of his blood, but from a woman he disdained. To get rid of that, he had also promised to give her 100 quid a year indefinitely. He had lost all his money in the collapse of the Siberian Railroad. And on the very day of the medical exam, he was about to set out to commit very public adultery to free him to marry the woman of his dreams. So it's no wonder his complexion was sallow, that he hadn't been eating. And the funny thing about this is it's a very amusing story if you know George Finch. But you know, it solves one of the great mysteries of Himalayan mountaineering. And that's what I meant by there's research and there's Xeroxing.
Wonderful. So.
Gentlemen?
My question is addressed to you, Mr. Wade Davis. I'm just wondering if we are still talking about the Everest or the war. Would a question on Everest be relevant?
Oh, yes, of course.
Okay. You said you're not interested in whether Mallory reached the top or not, but I think all of us are.
Well, of course,
and
I am
will
too.
Forever be.
Yeah.
And it would be invaluable to have your opinion as to whether, given the evidence that is available, which is his camera was never found, but his goggles were found in his pockets, which suggests that he was probably having a sunset descent and didn't need them. These are bits of evidence which are available. And I think this controversy will go on, and we would be interested in knowing what your views are.
Well, you know,
the last thing is whether, in passing, you could refer to the merits of the book by John Krickwauer and Anatoly Bukreev on Everest climbing in general, if that is...
Well, the first question is more apropos to this. Of course, I'm interested, like everybody else, whether Mallory got to the top, but what I really meant to say is my fundamental interest was not that. You know, Sir Henry Hillary famously said, when always asked that question, he said, well, I think some part of mountaineering is getting down. You know, we know from Conrad's a good friend of mine who found Mallory's body, and he then replicated Mallory's approach the following week on Everest. And if you read his account, as he first published it, he leaves little doubt that it's unlikely Mallory got up. You know, on the Northeast Ridge, there are really only 2 impediments, the first and second step. The first step can be turned. The second step involves a rather precipitous 120-foot bit of rock that's exposed 10,000 feet to either side to the Kanchung face or to the Rongbuk Glacier. We know that, for example, Conrad and his partner Dave Hahn left at 2 in the morning on that final approach from what would be close to Mallory's high camp and did not return until 9 p.m. the next day. We know that Mallory was severely dehydrated. They had lost their stove. They hadn't been able to melt water. Sandy Irvin was suffering severe sun blistering on his face. They clearly were not in the strongest state. They left their torch behind in the tent. That doesn't necessarily imply anything because Mallory was always leaving everything behind. But we do know that the rope, they were not allowed to use, they were not able to use crampons. They did have crampons, but the crampons they had in 1924 tended to cause frostbite severely and so could not be used at the highest elevations. We know Conrad required his crampons to make that ascent. We know that the ropes that they had were 7 times weaker and shorter than the ropes that a modern climber has, which would have meant down climbing the second step as climbers do today with a belay from a prominent boulder, very difficult. And the real challenge would be that the technical challenge of the second step. George Mallory conceivably could have made that. We'll never know. He was a great rock climber. But Sandy Irvin, who had been picked for the expedition in good measure because of his physical toughness, had relatively little experience on mountains. I mean, Odell had taken him to the Lake District. He had climbed in Spitsbergen with Odell. But it's very unlikely that Sandy could have made that second step, and Mallory would never have abandoned him. And indeed, his body was found with the rope tied around. All of that said, there's one very intriguing possibility, which I think keeps us in the realm of mystery. Had the snows that plummeted the 1924 expedition, causing so much accumulation at the foot of the North Col that it forced Colonel Norton to retreat not once but 3 times down to base camp, had those snows accumulated on the northeast ridge, as similar precipitation did in fact accumulate in the fall of 1986, it's not inconceivable that a cone of snow could have formed that would have eliminated the impediment of the second step, allowing Mallory and Irvin to walk up the incline with the very speed with which Odell famously reported. And had they surmounted that second step, nothing would have kept Mallory from the top, because for that generation, as I say, life mattered less than the moments of being alive. And there's a final line that in my book, which actually comes from Billy Grenville, writing back to his father from the Western Front, 2 weeks after his brother Julian has been severely wounded, mortally wounded, and Billy would be killed a week later. And he says, "Father, out here, death is but a frail barrier that men pass through, gallant and singing every day." And so if Mallory had gotten to the top of the second step, nothing would have kept him from reaching the summit of Everest. And sadly, where his body was finally found at rest was very close to his camp. It brings up another issue, though. This American pursuit of the body of Irvin to find the camera that Howard Somerville had left with the hope that the frozen film could still be developed. It's an interesting clash between the Americans who found the body and the British. And the Americans gloss this with the so-called pursuit of science. Well, it's not the pursuit of science at all. It's a pursuit of filthy lucre, in my opinion. If you look at the televisions, I've seen the original footage of the discovery of Mallory's body, and this idea that the Americans treat it with such reverence is questionable in the extreme. There's footage of individuals chopping at the ice with their ice axes, unconscious that they're standing in their crampons on top of Mallory's body. They cuss and they swear. All they are interested in artifacts. They then do commit the body to an Anglican service, and they claim that they snipped a bit of skin out with the permission of the family for DNA analysis. 2 days ago, I had an email from Australia from George Mallory, the grandson of George Mallory, who said, "Our family never gave that permission, ever." And then, once the photographs of the corpse were selling for $40,000, they sent 2 climbers, good men, these aren't bad people, back to the body. Essentially, if you think strictly in terms of the liturgy of the Anglican service with which they had committed it to the ground, they then exhumed the grave, robbed the body, lifted the body up like a piece of frozen log, and Tom Pollard crawled underneath it to look face to face with Mallory's face. This has never been reported. He could see the blood on his face. Now, Pollard, to his credit, did not snap that face, because that face would have been worth $50,000. But nevertheless, the body was, in some sense, violated. And so now you forget that those images we saw of Mallory's body looking like an Elgin marble, that's highly unusual. Most corpses on Everest look like Egyptian mummies, shriveled and grotesque. Julie Summers, who wrote the fine biography of her great-uncle, Sandy Irvin, none of the Summers family, none of the Irvin family want to see images of their beloved Sandy as a enshrouded mummy on Everest. They want to remember the lad of 22, so vital and pure. And it raises a final interesting point. You know, people have, given the fate that awaited Sandy on the mountain, there's been a controversy why George Mallory took this relatively inexperienced climber. Well, the answer was, on Everest, technical prowess is less important than physical strength, and he was phenomenally strong. Secondly, he was a mechanical savant. He was a guy in charge of the oxygen apparatus. And there was even a suggestion that Mallory took him because he was sexually interested in the young lad, which is a total misreading of Mallory's sexuality or Irvin's libido. Mallory, by the age of 37, was a devoted father of 3 children. Irvin was devilishly heterosexual. I couldn't even find a mother of any of his friends at Oxford that he hadn't slept with. If they took this wonderful young boy aloft, and if they loved him so much, it was because he had escaped the war. Not totally. His cousin was killed. His own brother was splattered with mustard gas, causing scars that had to be bandage changed for the rest of his life until he died in 1965. But Sandy, in his vitality and his youth, in a way, represented to all of them on that mountain the spirit and dream for which they had all suffered so much and for which so many of their comrades and brothers had died in battle. So everybody in Britain, I think, would agree, and certainly the family would say, stop this dreadful commercial pursuit of this corpse. Let him lie on the mountain and let the mystery of the mountain remain.
Okay, let's take a question from you, sir, there, yeah.
Actually, I want to thank Patrick and you both. I'm from the Indian Army, and actually my corps was raised in 1911, just before the World War I. And we are not forgotten. And the first thing was raised was 1914 when the reinforcements, we set up that first and so on. And even last, say, a few months back, I actually presented a painting of our things on the wall. World War I, specifically.
Interesting.
I just want to thank you for that, for remembering our contribution. And Pondicherry has been, Pondicherry has been, Jan Martel, we had the Life of Pi. But on my visit to Pondicherry, I again found a World War I memorial there. These were lads who fought for the French. And they are not part of any kind of history as such. So the next project for Pondicherry.
Very interesting. It is a forgotten piece of history. Mr. Dixit, yeah.
Just coming.
Yeah. I would like to preface my remarks, not a question, with a quote from George Leigh Mallory, which is, have we vanquished the enemy? That word means nothing there. That gives a sense of what, how Mallory saw mountaineering, even though his more quoted remarks are because it is there. I think made in Canada.
New York.
New York, was it? Okay. My comment actually follows on the earlier statement by the gentleman from the Indian Army. The same way that you have plumbed the archives of North America and Europe to bring out this story of this horrific time, the pain of individuals is the same. So the Indians, and among whom you would probably have referred to the Gurkhas also as part of the Indian Army at that time, the story, there are no archives. So in a way, there's a whole volume of pain or experience, if you will, that is beyond us. There's no way to encapsulate it because there may just possibly be some letters written back home. And in particular, the Gurkhas, if you think of it this way, the rest of the Indian Army, at least were in the plains and had links somehow to the Sahibs. But the Nepali men came down from the hills, went away in faraway wars. Some of them never returned. The loss back home of the families and the pain of battle is something that I think can only be done justice in fiction. And moving on then to the mountaineering, The other area that is not discussed enough, we do hear now, and there are some writings on the Sherpas and their contributions. That is all fair, and I think there's still something more to be done on that sphere. But as Mike Cheney, a famous British Gorkha officer that also worked in the tea gardens and then started trekking in Nepal, his point used to be, and also Harka Gurung, the scholar, that the original climbers were from the mid-hill tribes of Nepal, the Gurungs and the Magars. Again, experience, they were the first to climb in Europe. And these are issues that that will not be talked about because there are no archives. So probably we'll have to wait for some fiction. Thank you.
Yeah. We've just got 2 minutes more, so very quickly the lady there.
Mr. Davis, it's an honor to have you here with us, and this is a much broader question, so is it okay if I broaden it up a little? So you introduced yourself as explorer in residence with National Geographic. Do you see a paradox in that title? And I'm curious to know how your ethnographic expeditions have been shaped by the institutions you've been associated with.
Well, explore in residence is a ridiculous oxymoron because we're never in residence, and I don't know why they came up with that term. I mean, the genesis of it is when the Geographic entered its second century, they wanted to embrace conservation as a major focus of their mission. And to personify that, they recruited 7 people, Jane Goodall for paleontology, Bob Ballard, who found the Titanic, some really wonderful people. And I was fortunate to be recruited as a social anthropologist, really with the mission of changing the way the world viewed and valued culture, if possible. I mean, and this was all driven by the terrible fact that you know, of the 7,000 languages spoken today, half aren't being taught to children. And a language is not just grammar and vocabulary. Language is a flash of the human spirit. It's a vehicle through which the soul of every culture comes into the world. Every language is an old-growth forest of the mind, a watershed of thought, an ecosystem of social and spiritual possibilities. And to be losing half of humanity's linguistic diversity is to be losing half of humanity's genius. And the tragedy of this is that it's occurring just at the time when geneticists have proven the anthropologists to be correct. Studies of the human genome leave no doubt whatsoever that the genetic endowment of humanity is a continuum. Race is an utter fiction. We are all drawn and cut from the same genetic cloth, all children of our common ancestors who walked out of the Rift Valley 60,000 years ago and settled every corner of the world. But the fascinating thing about that scientific revelation is if you accept that we all are cut from the same genetic cloth, which is demonstrably true, it means every culture shares the same genius. And whether that genius is expressed through technological wizardry, which has been the great achievement of the West, or by contrast invested into unraveling the complex threads of memory inherent in a myth, is simply a matter of choice and cultural orientation. There is no progression in the affairs of culture. That old Victorian idea that there was a ladder to success that plopped Victorian England at the apex of a pyramid that went down to the so-called primitives of the world has been thoroughly ridiculed by modern science, and is as much an artifact of the 19th century as a notion that clergymen had that the earth was only 6,000 years old. And what this means is that the other peoples of the world are not failed attempts at being you. They're not failed attempts at being modern. Each is a unique answer to a fundamental question: what does it mean to be human and alive? And when the peoples of the world answer that question, they do so in 7,000 different voices. And those voices collectively become our human repertoire for dealing with the challenges that will confront us as a species in the coming millennia. So the way I do that at the Geographic is to tell stories not of the exotic other, as anthropologists have been prone to do, but deeply metaphorical stories, so that, for example, I made a film on the Buddhist science of the mind. Why the science? Well, what is science but the empirical pursuit of the truth? What is Tibetan Buddhism, as His Holiness told us the other day, but the scientific pursuit of an understanding, the empirical observation on the nature of mind. A Lama in Tibet once said to me, we in Tibet don't believe that you went to the moon, but you did. You may not believe we achieve enlightenment in one lifetime, but we do. You know, so what I'm always trying to do is, if you took all the genius that allowed us to put a man on the moon and applied it to the ocean, you'd get Polynesia. You know, and so the tragedy is that we're living through this era when this incredible range of the human imagination is being lost, and it doesn't have to happen. These cultures aren't drifting away as if as if fated to do so. In every case, they are being driven out of existence by identifiable forces, and that's an optimistic observation, because if human beings are the agents of cultural destruction, we can be the facilitators of cultural survival.
Thank you, Wade, and thank you all very much for coming. I know there are quite a few of you who would still like to ask questions. Wade and I will now be going to the book tent to sign, so do please come along there and ask the questions that you were unable to ask right now. Thank you very much.
Yes, the book signing desk, as you probably already know, is just behind that pillar. Please do take your questions to our wonderful panelists. And a final round of applause for Wade Davis and Patrick French. Thank you both so much. That was a wonderful discussion. So just a little reminder, it's obviously lunch now, but there will be a debate after our final